All righty. Welcome to Homeschool, May 14th. Also, welcome to this edition of Homeschool. My name is Colby Caldwell, and I am the program director here at Revolve. We are thrilled to continue our partnership with Southern Equality Studios. I'm going to continue to admit folks. We began hosting their monthly meetups in our physical space here in Asheville almost a year ago, and their presence has added so very much to our community at Revolve and in the region as well. Before we get started with our program tonight, I just have a few housekeeping things to announce. We are working on some wonderful upcoming programs that will happen each Thursday in May. I'd like to share our next one. Next Thursday, on the 21st of May, we have a poetry reading with Eric Tran and Julia Block, which will be moderated by Elaine Blakeney. We are also working on some more co-sponsored events, and we'll be announcing those in the coming weeks. Please go to www.revolveavl.org/home-school, which I'll drop in the chat here in just a second, to see the latest updates on our programming. As Bernard mentioned just earlier, this is, I think, our 5th program in this new initiative that we started since COVID-19. And we are looking forward to continue to find partnerships and collaborations with throughout our community here in Western North Carolina and beyond. So if you're interested in what we're doing and how we do it, please contact us, and we would love to work with you in the future. Now just some quick notes about tonight's program. We recommend that you set your Zoom view to speaker view, not grid, as you'll be able to hear and see our guests easier. You'll find that at the top right button, and you'll see there's 2 options. You get a grid or a speaker view. We recommend the speaker view. As was mentioned earlier, for tonight's program, please put any questions you might have in the chat, and I will collate and present them to the guests. Once I read your question, I will unmute you, and you can comment and follow up as needed. We will take pauses throughout the program to bring your questions forward, and we will have some extra time at the end for continued questions and discussion. The idea is to find a balance between discussion and dialogue. Before I turn the program over to this evening's moderator, Bernard Welt, and to our guests, I'd like to thank our subscribers, donors, and especially our friends at Photo Plus and Dot Editions, whose generous support make what we do happen. I also want to thank all of y'all for participating tonight. It means so much to us when our community shows up. And we are really excited about this program tonight. And before I continue to talk about my excitement, I'm going to pass this on to our moderator tonight, Bernard Welt, who's going to introduce our guests and start the evening. Hey, Bernard.
Thanks. My calm and serene manner belies my excitement. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to get my view here clear. Okay. Colby, you're still showing up on speaker view. I don't know why that is. Well, okay, I'm speaking. I said we would try not to have technological problems, but here we go. So I'll just mention that I am a former professor and now Professor Emeritus at the Corcoran College of Art and Design in Washington, D.C., which is now part of George Washington University. I've done some writing on the arts. But as I was telling the panelists earlier, this is something that I'm really curious about and don't have a lot of the contacts and don't follow all of the periodicals to find out exactly what's going on. The question that we pose to our panelists tonight is, how are artists and art organizations meeting the challenges of COVID-19 and social isolation? What are our special concerns, responsibilities, and opportunities? And the kind of stuff that I've been reading has been focused on opportunities, but I sort of don't want us to just, go Pollyanna all the time, because I have a personal feeling that some of the issues that are most confronting us during this crisis are exacerbations, distillations of the kinds of concerns and problems we're facing all the time, created by social inequalities, et cetera. So without pushing that agenda, I'm going to ask people a few questions intended to bring out some of those points, but I'm also hoping that these very distinguished panelists will speak for themselves. I've already told them how excited I am to get yeses from this particular group of people. We're going to be talking tonight with Al Murray and Liz Williams from Southern Equality and Southern Equality Studios, who are artists. And they'll explain how they came to propose this to Homeschool. And also Chelsea Dobert-Kehn, who is with Queer Appalachia and Electric Dirt, Stephen Evans, the executive director of FotoFest, Annie Flanagan, a photojournalist, Andy Johnson, who's an artist and art historian and the director of Gallery 102 at the George Washington University, and Hunter Ohanian, the director of the Stonewall Museum and Archives and the founding director of the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Art in New York. I'm going to ask them to say a few words about themselves by way of introduction. But before that, I want to mention, since Colby said, put your comments into chat, please. He'll start to collate them, and then we'll pause periodically to get to them. If you have contributions to make about resources that are available, websites that people should go to, would you enter those into the chat at any time, and we'll hold those till about the last 20 minutes of the planned time for tonight, and try to throw some of them up on the screen. We'll also be asking our panelists, and you can bring them up later. So let me ask you, one by one, or in this case, two by one. We'll start with Al and Liz, and you can decide if you want to pass it back and forth. If you would just let us know what you particularly are interested in about the issues confronting LGBTQ queer artists during COVID-19, and what you wanted to bring to this group tonight, perhaps in the form of an example, citing a trend or something of that kind. That's Liz and Al. You want to
Sure.
go one by one?
We're going to speak in unison. We like to do this.
That's exciting.
Drum thing we heard one time at Revolve. It's pretty sweet.
Sometimes I'll drink water and I'll speak and vice versa. Water will come out of my mouth.
It's brilliant. The effect is a little lost in the digital world, so we're not going to do that tonight. But yeah, thanks Bernard. Thanks y'all for coming. It's really awesome to see y'all. And many of you we would never meet had it not been for this. So hi, it's nice to meet you. Thanks for hanging out. So I'll give you a little bit of background about what Southern Equality Studios is, so you have an idea of the sort of the vantage point we're coming from to this. Campaign for Southern Equality is a nonprofit. It's based in the South and works for LGBTQ lived and legal equality all across the South. So we work on a range of issues in a range of ways, and what inevitably came up for the organization was that arts and artists are catalysts for change. They always have been, they always will be, and that meant that if we were going to really see some actual change and progress in the South for LGBTQ folks, the artists had to be involved in the work of CSE. So that's what sparked Southern Equality Studios, which started as a couple of pop-up residencies in Asheville, North Carolina, and then that expanded into a year-long residency where we approached Liz and said, hey Liz, you're phenomenal, you're wonderful, you're this force for good in our community. Please join us and share your work with the world. And that sparked a collaboration between myself and Liz. So I've been a metal worker for about 6 years. I own a business here in Asheville, and I also work for the Campaign for Southern Equality. So we collaborated and found that really the most exciting part of the work we were doing was reaching out to other queer artists. I think at our first meeting, I asked Liz, I was like, yeah, so who do you know? And Liz was like, and I was like, yeah, me too. So what's up with that? We really don't need to be this isolated. So immediately we started reaching out to people and coming up with platforms for queer artists in the South to connect. We realized we're not the only people undertaking this kind of project, which is why we continually try to create spaces for people to get together. And that's where our queer artist meetups come in. I'll hand things over to Liz to expand on that.
Okay, so thank you, Al. So my name is Liz. I use the pronouns she, her, they, them. And I was really excited to join up with Al, and Al explained everything up until the Queer Artist Meetup. So basically, we did a summer series called Uprooted, and that brought us to the idea of like, let's make this a little bit more interactive outside of the models slash artists who are working with us. So we reached out to the artists who were participating, as well as Chelsea, to do this panel discussion, which was at Revolve Gallery. And after that panel discussion, we were like, let's continue these connections. So we started to have meetups with queer artists at Revolve, and it was awesome because it just kept growing with different people revolving in and out at Revolve. And after that happened, and we created like a little bit of a community, COVID happened, and so we definitely wanted to continue creating connections with people, and luckily people were up for doing that as well, like via Zoom meetings. And through the Zoom meetings, we realized like people are interested in receiving resources. And so we worked on making like a directory of resources. We worked like super hard on having all these different avenues of like things you can do, places you can get funds. And our scope is like so limited with like where we live and the different connections that we have. And outside of that, we also saw that people, they needed connection. Like they just wanted to have a place, a platform to like show their art while they're in their safe spaces, trying not to go insane. And so we were really excited to have that platform available for them. And we've had art critiques, and we've had workshops and skill shares digitally, and it's just been really cool. And now we have this meetup with all these different people from around the country, and that's really super rad and amazing. I can't believe people showed up and wanted to contribute. So thank you so much, everybody. And I think that's all I have to say.
Yeah, that was perfect. So we have noticed some themes with the people who've come to the meetups. Since they've gone digital, and we can talk about these a little bit more later, probably as they come up for other people, but there's been a lot more experimentation that we've heard people talking about, that they're trying new stuff. And then also just things have gotten a lot more intimate in our gatherings. Like I don't know if it's because we have a screen as a filter, or if it is because people are in these safe spaces. We're talking to people in their bedrooms, we're talking to people in their homes. Maybe we're the only people they've talked to that day. And for queer people in isolation, that kind of intimacy just feels really important. So that's been really special about what we've been able to do.
Thank you very much. I just want to mention to the group that in case you weren't here when we discussed it at the beginning, we're going to hold our questions till later. And I noticed as Liz and Al talk that there's a lot of stuff that they're saying that is going to be sort of applying to everyone who speaks tonight. Like, for example, thinking about the South as a region and its particular issues. Revolve and Homeschool now have also been very concerned about the economic transition of the South and of Appalachia in particular. And it isn't a kind of rooting for the arts or anything like that to say that they really do lead. They lead the arts in a variety of different forms, lead people into new situations. So I'm going to come to the next person that's going to speak to us tonight, and that's Chelsea Dobert-Kehn. I hope I'm saying your name right.
Almost. It's Chelsea Dobert-Kehn, but it's very close.
Okay. I was trying to be German and everything.
It is, but I think it got a little lost in pronunciations generations ago.
Yeah, I'm Bernard Welt. So what I was asking people is just tell us a little bit about how you connect with LGBTQ artists and arts organizations, what you think is really interesting and important and maybe concerning about what's going on at this particular moment. And if you want to give an example, that would be great.
Absolutely. My name is Chelsea Dobert-Kehn. I go by they, them pronouns. I am very familiar to the Western Carolina area because I used to go to Western Carolina University. I graduated from there a year ago with my MFA. And during my time there, I was doing a lot of research into queer art and queer community building. And that brought me to Queer Appalachia, which is started out as a zine collective and has evolved into something a little bigger and more abstract. Like, we're a media collective, and we do a lot of social praxis work, which can look like coat drives or phone drives or fundraising for different folks. But what we've noticed during COVID we interact with a couple 100,000 of social media followers each day. So we have a pretty broad survey of what's happening in queer communities in Appalachia, in the South, and other rural spaces. And what we've seen happening is like this huge switch to our Zoom and Twitch events. Specifically, there's been a lot of drag shows, how the nature of drag shows have changed. We see a lot of those happening on Twitch, like weekly. And one of the things I think is the most interesting is that people have had to become their own tech experts, or at least try to become their own tech experts. So that looks like a lot of drag queens are now learning how to edit their own videos, because instead of performing live in front of people, they're now having to create their own video segments for these drag shows that are like streamed over Twitch or Zoom or anything like that. Another thing that I've seen is a huge cry for help from people who don't have resources to kind of like wait out a quarantine. One thing that we do at Queer Appalachia every day is we're working in fundraising, and we get messages from folks who are struggling. And what we try and do is combine these two parts of what we do, like this fun side and this event side, with this like fundraising aspect or mutual aid. We're seeing just about like every major queer Instagram account engaging in some sort of mutual aid project, which I think is great because it's very clear that we're not going to get the help that we need from our government. And the example I can give you is our big ass telethon to end metronormativity, which was a pretty massive streamed event that we somehow managed to pull off last month. We did this in combination with Wussy Magazine, Southern Fried Queer Pride, and ourselves. And the idea was to help raise money for our queer performers who are out of work due to COVID. People like drag queens or comedians or other artists, people whose income streams have been disrupted. And we got couple hundred people viewing it, and I think 2,000 folks viewed it that night. But we were able to raise almost 10 grand for folks, which we gave out in the form of like little micro grants. And we're gonna do it again because there's still people who need resources and some grants. So we're fixing to do our next one next at the end of the month on the 30th.
So we'll want to provide a link for that for people. So, and if we don't manage it tonight, we'll put it up on Homeschool. Chelsea, since you brought it up, and I know we're going to come back to both more general questions and to resources, I just wanted to ask you, you've mentioned drag performers and people who work, as we call it, freelance, part-time, in the gig economy, et cetera. What kind of issues in sustaining themselves are you seeing among people? Do you think that queer artists are particularly vulnerable economically right now?
Absolutely. We see that in people DMing the account or emailing. What I can tell is that events have been canceled and venues, bars where drag shows are held are pretty much shut down, and it's up to people and organizations to pivot really quickly and try and figure out some way to stream these events. But the other side of that is that people don't have the same kind of money to tip or pay for this content, and that's something that I'm hearing a lot of conversations about, being very mindful and providing content that doesn't involve a paywall, because it's important that we try and keep it accessible. So in some way, though, having these events cost less is a great way to reach a broader audience in quarantine, now that no one's going out and you don't have to pay quite as much. More people can participate.
Right. So some people are managing to conserve their resources during this time because they're not going out, et cetera. But we do have an awful lot of people who do not have health care, do not have health insurance because they don't have a full-time job, because that's the way this economy is structured. And as I've been researching this stuff in the last week or so, what I've seen is a lot of terrible stories about prejudicial treatment, especially for trans people when they do show up with a medical problem. It's just extremely concerning that there's a particular problem that comes up when people are identified as queer when they show up at a lot of medical facilities. So thank you. We're going to move on to Annie Flanagan, who's a photojournalist with some experience with documenting the COVID-19 pandemic. Annie, if you would just say your interest in LGBTQ artists and arts organizations, and maybe a little bit about how you've been connected and what you've done.
Hi, I'm Annie. Like you said, I'm a photojournalist, documentary photographer, and most of the work I do focuses on queer experiences, particularly rural America or non-major metropolitan areas. And I guess I want to do the second thing, which is like a trend that I've seen that I like, or that I'm also excited to see more of, is just this like long distance collaboration, and how like there's a Instagram account called Women Photograph, which is for like women, trans and non-binary photographers, and an offshoot of that, I think it's like WP Journal, but I might be wrong, is like, you know, did this thing where they like grouped photographers in a group of 4 or 6, and each week they're, you know, sharing these, they're across the world, like sharing these thematic journals of their experience during COVID. And it's just really beautiful to see like people interpreting writing or people interpreting words, or like the themes that they're building off of has been really nice to see. And, you know, I think a coping mechanism for the isolation. Did I miss something? Was there a second part that I didn't answer?
No, not at all. I'm actually just curious about whether you feel strongly that what you're seeing is different from what you've documented as a photojournalist before.
The interaction. So when this first happened, I was like having really bad anxiety, like many of us, and still do. But I couldn't really sleep, and I would wake up and hang out with my neighbor in the backyard, and then I would go make portraits throughout, particularly the French Quarter, but throughout the city. I live in New Orleans, and I don't do like street photography a lot. Like usually I'm photographing in people's homes during like very intimate times of their life. And so it was different, but it was also very similar, like on the streets, because this is such a collective experience, and there weren't a lot of distractions, that like the ability to stop and talk and not have like a million people around really, I just like allowed for a different type of interaction that I've experienced before, which I think was just really nice. I mean, it was, you know, like people generally I find are like, if you're photographing or if I'm photographing something, like open up fairly easily, like if they have something on their mind. And so we all have this on their mind. So the ways that it's affecting people financially or personally, like it's like easy to talk about because, it's felt easier to talk about because everybody's going through it, which is a pretty unique situation, right. Unfortunately. But so that's changed. And I think, you know, figuring out ways like to collaborate, like long distance photo collaborations, or like I had a big project I was going to start, which was like a whole road trip, or, you know, like, and I put that on hold, and now I'm like, okay, how do I like do this work I set out to do and planned for, and now have to like take all of these precautions in mind, and how do I like work as a journalist and make compelling, like intimate, emotional work and still keep everyone safe. And basically like I like act as if I'm an asymptomatic carrier, and like what does that look like, and what because I don't think it should be a barrier for making powerful work right now, but it's just a matter of like I not, you know, like respecting each other and caring for each other at the same time, which I like to think happens all the time, but here, you know, just the conditions are a little different.
That's about a really profound question about the relationship between artist and subject, and artist and audience, about empathy. And also another thing that I'm hearing a great deal myself is that, sort of paradoxically, even while people are having difficulty making a living, they're working more than ever. And one of the things that the isolation is kind of helping people, because, you know, a lot of artists are introverts in one way or another. One of the things that the isolation is helping people with is just spending more time focused. And speaking of focus, I love segues. I moved from a photographer to another photographer, Stephen Evans. If you could just tell us, Stephen, what your experience is of LGBTQ artists and arts organizations during this pandemic, and maybe give us an example or two of something that particularly interests you.
Wow. I run FotoFest, which is an arts organization based in Houston, Texas, and it's one thing that brought me to the organization after years of working for other arts organizations like the Art Foundation in New York, was its commitment to addressing issues within society through its programming, and its commitment to helping photographers through a large portfolio review program that we conduct every 2 years and sometimes internationally. So and since I've been there, I came in at 2014, and in 2015 I organized the first LGBTQIA show that FotoFest had ever had. They'd shown plenty of queer artists, but there'd never been a show around those themes. It was called I Am a Camera. And so I'm always thinking, and my staff is always thinking, about diversity and transparency, and wanting to touch as many important issues as we can, and to bring voices to the table, to bring the artists inside the room, give them a platform to talk from. So in that way, the pandemic has changed what we do a little bit, but it's created, I've realized, and I think many of us have, is it's created new opportunities for us, new platforms that are available for us to use to get the word out. Right now, we have a very large exhibition in our galleries called African Cosmologies, and it was curated by Mark Seeley, a British curator, thinking about the idea of Africa more than the geography of Africa. And there's a fair amount of queer artists in the exhibition, including one named Leo, who did a collaboration with an artist named Shoban Bal, and we had a public program about their work. Eric Giamfi is a photographer from Ghana who documents his LGBTQ family community there. And so we are, as I said, we're bringing voices to the table. And what we've noticed is that this platform, which we plan to continue if and when things return to a new normal or a new abnormal, we plan to continue this digital platform because it's let us connect, just like tonight. It's let us connect with people all over the country and all over the world. And it's instantly broadened our reach. And although there is an income inequality aspect to connecting digitally, it's a lot of people do have the access. And so I think it's really helped the organization think about how it's reaching out and how it's connecting and what are the opportunities that we have. You know, we have to ensure that we remain distinct, that we remain necessary, and that we're serving the artists, because as was remarked earlier in the program, the artists lead the way. I'm an artist also. The co-founders of FotoFest are also photographer, artists, and journalists. So it's always been an artist-centric viewpoint, and I'm really proud to continue that. we've, I really wanted to do this program with Eric, and there's also another program that we're doing with a cis male photographer that identifies as straight, but also his creative partner who has a trans identity, a dual identity. And that should be very interesting too. David Johnson and Philip Matthews. And that's another program we're doing. So we've really been thinking about diversity throughout. I'm proud that we're one of the organizations that's doing that. And I think platforms like this are so important because and I think there was some reading that was distributed to everyone that registered for the talk, and sort of a passive experience of walking through a gallery and clicking on an image to see an artwork is not really what we need right now. And I'm echoing another comment that was made earlier, is we need connection. As queer people, we spend a fair amount of time, usually in our youth, where we're extremely alienated and we feel very alone. And so this has connected me with some of that depression at times. And so moments like this, or a webinar that I saw earlier this week, where the host, who's part of the talk tonight, did the very simple act of acknowledging who was in the audience and had thanked everybody. It creates community and it creates connection, and that's, besides the economic factors and the healthcare factors, there's that emotional and mental health aspect that I think art can really provide something valuable in that area right now.
Thank you. You're very good at giving me the segues, because actually, when you say talking to the audience, I want to let people know, just to pause here for a moment. I see quite a lot of people have come in since about 9:15. So I want to let them know that any questions and comments can go into the chat. They'll go directly to Colby Caldwell, and we'll pause periodically to bring up things from the audience. Colby, do we have anything that people have entered into the chat that you want to bring up?
No, not yet, Bernard.
Okay. So I remind you, here it is. If you have resources you'd like to share and cite, we will collect them and talk about them in the last 20 minutes or so of our conversation tonight. And if there's any comments or questions that go to particular speakers tonight, we will hold those until everyone has spoken. And then, I'm always kind of bubbling over with stuff I want to bring up. So I'm going to withhold myself a little bit, and I want to assure the audience that we'd really like to give you some time to I think in particular, because of what Stephen brought up, I do want to make sure that we ask you, what do artists need right now? And ask that of other artists, and also ask that of arts organizations, because we have people representing quite a few with us this evening. So just to remind you, we've heard from we've heard from Liz Williams and Al Murray of Southern Equality. We've heard from Stephen Evans from FotoFest in Houston, Annie Flanagan, photojournalist. And now we're going to ask Andy Johnson, the gallery director at Gallery 102 in Washington, D.C., to jump in. And Andy, I think you've heard what kind of thing other people are talking about.
Yeah. Thank you, Bernard. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
By the way, you look amazing.
Do I?
Oh, of course.
Because I don't feel it.
I'm sorry.
I don't have COVID, so don't think that. But yeah, just the general exhaustion and tiredness of doing absolutely nothing. It's funny, when you emailed me and you said you must be so busy. I was like, with what?
Okay, this is the other side of the story we're getting.
I'm just at home. But yeah, no, I think everything that everybody has brought up, I really relate to. And one thing that I've often thought about is this sort of like cognitive dissonance that I have often, of thinking about one side of sort of all of these opportunities and just the way that our day-to-day has completely shifted, and how that has changed how we relate to one another and the opportunities, like other people have mentioned, that creates, but then at the same time holding space for just all of the challenges and the influx of news that is constantly sent to us, and having to sort of sift through all of that, of sort of the inequalities, dealing with healthcare, jobs, unemployment, and sort of just the frustration of having to be sort of a bystander in that, and sort of sitting with that. And so just that cognitive dissonance for me, just like having to sit with both of those feelings at the same time, of thinking about these moments of opportunity, but then also having to deal with just the actual reality of where our country is headed at this moment. And one thing I find really interesting, and it was brought up in a couple of the articles that we read, and there was another article that I recently read from Essence. It was written actually by one of the employees from the new museum who was instrumental in unionizing their staff. She wrote an article for them. It's titled "The Museum Does Not Exist. Pay what you can, see what you can't." But in the hyperallergic article, it was interesting to me because there's this part of me finds it very interesting, and a lot of these writers are pointing to this about how suddenly everything is so deeply accessible, when before this moment it was you had to pay a subscription to enter this, or you had to be a member, or you had to you had to prove some sort of financial stability on your end to be able to gain access to sort of elitism to these institutions. And then suddenly when this happens, everything is free, accessible. You can download PDFs, you can do all of these things. And so obviously a lot of the disability rights activists are looking them in the face like, are you serious? We've been fighting for this for years, and now suddenly you can make all of this stuff available. And in the hyperallergic article, they point to the fact that, like, and this is obviously a hypothesis, I don't know if you can really prove that this is true, although I think a lot of people on this call would agree in that because museums lost a significant amount of their audience, which is white, they suddenly sort of shifted their model to reflect that loss in their audience, where had we seen a large dip in Black or Hispanic communities who visited these museums, I don't think that museums would be reacting in the same way. And so I think in many ways in the art world, especially with institutions, we had this sort of precipitous moment in terms of salaries, what people were being paid, the sort of transparency with that, the ties of board members, what sort of investments they have. And so there was this really interesting moment where things felt like they were kind of moving, the wheels were sort of greasing. And in a way, I don't think it's necessarily stopped, but in this moment, I think we see just how much more deeply invested these institutions are in larger systems of oppression, and how MoMA, who has a multi-million-dollar endowment and has enormous access to funds, and their directors are obviously being paid enormous salaries, can cut entire sections of their employees and staff without even blinking. And so it's sort of that precarious position that they're in. So I bring that up to say that I think that there's a really interesting point at which you suddenly have this massive amount of information that you can access, and resources and digital files and archives that we have access to, that I think are really amazing. But at the same time, we have to question, why are they suddenly accessible? How did we suddenly allow the gates to be open to have all of these resources become accessible? What sort of precipitated that in the first place, when people have been asking that of museums for a very long time? And a trend that I sort of see as well is and from myself personally, and a lot of the people that I am in contact with and I talk to on a regular basis, is I think this moment of isolation has forced a lot of people to sort of reckon with the sort of emotional toll, or the sort of emotional affective sort of experiences that they have that they may neglect in their daily life. I think a lot of people who aren't used to sort of sitting with themselves are panicking, and so you suddenly have this moment where you realize you have a lot more work to do on yourself than you realized, and a lot of issues and things in your past that you have to work through. And so I think that there's this interesting turn towards care and sort of empathetic acts of care for self and your community. And it feels a little more heightened, I think, for people, because suddenly we're thrown in this very sort of contrasting environment where we see how important and how radical acts of care can be in a moment like this. So, yeah.
Thanks, Andy. I'm just going to follow up on that for one moment by saying, as some of you know, but many probably don't, my academic subject actually is dreams and their relationship to the arts, and I work with the International Association for the Study of Dreams frequently on programs. And right now I'm running open dream cafes twice a week where people come and share their dreams. And a lot of my colleagues, I'm not a psychologist, but many of them are, and are credentialed to talk about this subject. They're kind of barraged by people who are paying attention to their dreams right now. And that's, on the same lines that you're talking about. All of a sudden, things that people would dismiss that are going on within them are starting to come up, and they're asking questions about themselves. And I don't mean to soapbox it, but the phenomena that you're talking about, it feels like this thing that a lot of people are saying in response to this terrible crisis is it feels like everything that's happened in technology and society in the last 30 years or so has been building up to this, that we've been spending so much time isolated looking at screens already, that we've had so many crises in the healthcare system. And so, it's a valuable thing to remember that this is not something that a virus did. This is something that a particular kind of social system and the lack of equal access did to us all. And with that, we have somebody who is probably as well prepared to talk about museums as anyone in the United States. I'm very glad to have here this evening Hunter Ohanian. Speaking from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, right? You still have Hunter?
Here. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
I had to unmute there.
Right.
It's nice to see you all, and thank you so much for asking me to be here. It's been a great conversation so far, and I've really enjoyed being a part of it. There have been so many big issues and ideas put on the table. I don't even know where to begin, but let me try to start with your initial quick questions, and then maybe I can respond to a few things that I've heard so far. So the question is, first of all, a view of how everything that's going on is affecting arts organizations. Drastically, awfully, horribly, on the deathbed, it is as bad as it can possibly be. And the reason why that is that with the exceptions of the Mets and the Whitneys and the MoMAs and probably 100 organizations, arts organizations in the United States, I think everybody's aware that they are radically undercapitalized. They do not have the resources to do all the work that they need to do. And so many organizations don't even have a 6-month cash reserve. They don't have a 4-week cash reserve. And so, look, I'm 65 years old. I've never seen anything like what's happened in the last two months. 10% of the population of the United States has filed for unemployment benefits. Over 30 million people lost their jobs in the last two months. We are now over 80,000 people have died. 1,500 people more today than the day before. Those of us who lived through HIV and AIDS, we can talk about that. There are tremendous similarities between both of these situations, but we have not seen anything like this. This is something which is profoundly unique. The idea that the United States government would put $2 trillion into the economy, and then the House of Representatives is talking about adding another $3 trillion. This is something in which it's far beyond anybody on this call. And what I really think is that the people who are going to be impacted the most are those that are in their formative years, probably 6, 7, 8, up until 20, who are going to be formed by having ridden this incredible wave. There are things that have happened with regard to past generations who have felt left out, but there are people who are going to feel, those in high school, those in college, those that feel that what actually has happened to them has been very severe. And that transcends gay, straight, trans, black, white, male, female. That's across the board. But if you wanted to find a dividing line across there, it's money, it's class, and it's access. Those that have access and those that have resources are the ones who can actually say to the colleges of their kids, you know, we need to let them have a year off so they won't be unsafe next year. They have the luxury of being able to demand that of college presidents. But so for organizations, it's a very tough time. I will say I am surprised that the federal programs that have happened in the last 2 months have actually been an amazing lifesaver. We laid one person off. We cut 3 employees by 60% salary. And because of this crazy PPP thing, we were able to bring everybody back, which I find sort of amazing. And my cynical sense to think that the federal government would actually come to the aid of a queer library and archive in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and that it would happen that fast is sort of astonishing to me. I don't have anything else to compare that kind of speed to. I don't fully understand why it actually worked. So we, like everybody else, we're here on these different platforms. We're doing a lot more programming now than we were before, and nicely we are reaching a much larger audience than we were before, and all that is very good. I think the work for artists is really very tough right now. I think the impact is tough, because if you take a group of individuals, those of us who practice any kind of art form, whether it be music or literary or visual, and we know that that is not usually a self-sustaining professional path that we've gone down. We know that there's a certain amount of sacrifice that has to be made. And then you put another layer on top of that. If you happen to be queer, then you are sort of apart from the mainstream there. And you've learned how to piece things together with this job and that job and things that are going on. And then you have this tsunami of cultural and economic change. And it's really about economic and political change that's actually happening here. For artists right now and for queer artists right now, people are scared. They are they're looking for a place to be able to find resources, to be able to find community. They don't know what they've done, whether or not what they've done in the past is going to be worth anything in the future. There are many, many doubts that are happening as a result of this. I think the last thing, and I'll stop, is that what I guess it goes back to the other point that, and I think we're all a bit victim of it at this point, is it has to do with access, and it has to do with the weakest ones in our whole system. That when something this devastating comes along, they're the ones that are going to be hurt the most. And I think what I'm really struck with these days are these people who are designated to be essential workers. They're working in the meat plants. They're working to supply food. And then the moment we deem them to be essential workers because we believe as society their role is important. And then the minute something happens to them, they're just pushed out of the way without any support, without any health care, and anything to back those individuals up. And there is an equation that's going on that is really, it seems to be the equation, and this is from Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals. It seems as if the equation that's going on is that there has to be a certain amount of sacrifice that has to be made. And that sacrifice may actually have a human price on it for the betterment of the entire country. And it's not a philosophy that I'm particularly used to hearing. If we think back in the early 1980s when AIDS, people didn't say HIV then, they just said AIDS. When AIDS happened, the belief was, well, these are all degenerate, immoral homosexuals. What's the loss? Now we have a situation where we have an environment and a political philosophy in place where racial minorities, income minorities, ethnic minorities are considered disposable in the same way for the greater good. Before, with the AIDS situation, people didn't want to spend the money for research. And now people don't want to spend money for providing care to other people. So it's a bleak situation. It's a bleak situation for all of us. I think many of us, I personally, I'm very much on the fence. I live here in Florida and we've got just the craziest governor you can imagine possible. Although if anybody's here from Texas or from Georgia, I think you probably have a speed. Yes, hi, Stephen. But, you know, we're opening counties, closing them, you know, opening beaches, closing them, you know, nobody knows what's going on. And I guess all we can do is just hope that there will be some solution in a short period of time, and that the naysayers out there who say we're going to hit some other wave going forward, or we're going to hit some other bump in the winter, that those predictions are not true, and that we can begin to allow ourselves to support each other in a much broader way than we're doing right now. But it's a confounding problem, and it's one in which I just don't know a way out of.
Well, thank you. In a minute, I'd like to come back to what Liz and Al started with, the notion of the arts as catalysts for change, and maybe get a little bit more specific about it. We've talked about a lot of things that are general to the situation in the whole country, no matter who you are, artist or not, LGBTQ or not. I want to spend some time with the more specific issues. But first, we have a couple of questions from the audience that Colby's going to bring up.
Thanks, Bernard. From Rachel, they, them. Annie brought up how artists interact with subjects, specifically with being a potential carrier of COVID and putting a community at risk. Can artists who work with communities that are not their own as outsiders, usually in southern rural Appalachian communities, how is the pandemic impacting artists' ability to build community with subjects, individuals and or groups? Rachel specifically thinking of historical patterns building the other America narrative of southern rural and Appalachian communities for capitalist benefits. They are citing Elizabeth Katz, What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia. would anyone on the panel like to talk about issues of as a working artist, interacting with their subjects and being concerned about how COVID has affected that?
Annie's going to unmute herself.
Yeah, myself. I haven't been. Everyone I know that's working right now is working regionally, and I think that is really important. And I had one friend who came down from Tennessee, and the only reason to photograph in New Orleans and then like go back home to Tennessee, and she said the only reason she decided to take this job was because they had opened up like really rapid testing in Tennessee. So as soon as she got back, she was able to isolate for 2 weeks once she got home. So I think that's like just a really big consideration. Like I know that like like at least from journalism standpoint, like I know that newspapers aren't flying anyone anywhere. Like everyone they're hiring is either working remotely or photographing locally. And that's really important. But I think, like I was talking about like working on this project that I've been planning for years, and like where I work primarily in the Great Plains and like have lived for periods on and off in like North Dakota, Montana, and like I can't go back there. At what point is it like safe to re-enter and like go to these places? I think is sort of, I don't know, not doesn't feel safe yet. I will say that, but on like the larger scope of what you're talking about, I mean, I think that there's like logistical, I think like guidelines that you put in place for yourself and like how COVID impacts them, I personally haven't had experience with it yet, but I've like thought about it, I guess.
Anyone else on this panel?
Did that help at all?
Can I like have a follow-up real quick? Is that cool?
Yeah.
I was thinking like, so during like times of like in the Great Depression, from this book, from What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia, like there was, artists were paid by private companies and by the government to like photograph, and then it built a narrative around the other America and like the poor white South Appalachia as other, rather than like a product of this othering through the like capitalist system. And it like still is this narrative we see today, and like definitely with this president and everything like that. And I'm thinking of like how corporations, like you said, like news organizations or companies that still want to keep their business going, like Amazon, will still put those communities at risk to further their bottom line, just like these art groups or the government did in the 1920s with the Great Depression. And like we're putting communities at risk and also furthering an othered image of them during this time of crisis. And like if you are in those communities, what like when others come into it to kind of like benefit from this struggle and this pandemic and this challenge, like how are you dealing with it? And like what's a way we could combat it? And it sounds like, Annie, what you're saying is like doing it regionally and locally is like going back to the sources of the art and letting people do their own version of art in that way to keep their community safe and to like put the power back in the hands of the individuals who are local. But this is like a weird question. It has like no actual question, but like wanted to see what y'all thought.
Chelsea, were you going to address something that Rachel was talking about?
I was gonna say something about what Rachel was talking about was the invention of poverty porn, essentially, when photographers and documentarians came into the region and started photographing the poverty in the region. Those images are essentially the first images that came out of Appalachia and created a narrative around a community, just like you said, that's being othered. And ultimately that did far more damage than good. What I think is something that we have to be very mindful about when working with COVID and documenting it is trying not to copy or emulate that when dealing with people who are struggling, who are dealing with this virus, or people who are essential workers, but being forced to go to work in unsafe situations. I see something very similar in how the Amazon commercials or the Ford commercials, it seems like every corporation has spent so much money putting out their own version of "we're in this together."
Yeah.
This kind of commercial to, it's really just propaganda. And the thing that I'm responding to most is when I see those, I get pretty disgusted and upset at the amount of money that's going to these propaganda commercials, when really those thousands of dollars would be great if you just handed the people in those commercials that money.
Which in most cases, you know, all the way through the social system, it would be great if we would just hand the money to people instead of working on all this other stuff and doing PR and advertising. I just want to mention that What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia is a really great book and a great resource. And it's been important to us in thinking about Revolve and Homeschool. And it does go into that business of poverty porn that seems more than ever relevant at this moment. So I'm going to turn to the panelists in a moment, but Colby, do we have another question from the audience?
We do. We have a question from Rick. To all participants, can you suggest your favorite publicly available queer content? Docs, video works, live streams, webinars, online performances, archives, etc. What's not to miss? Which artists are inspiring you? Honestly, what are queers watching on Netflix?
It almost coming under resources, which we'll get to in a little bit. Let's just do this because it's kind of it's a vital question. Anybody? You probably don't have a favorite, okay? Something that you're following.
Well, I think that social media is really important right now in terms of just feeling connected and following what's going on. Today I saw, I'm Facebook friends with Catherine Opie, and I saw that she posted a photo from a protest, and there was a protester that held up a sign that said, "COVID is fake and gay." So there you have it. I can share that screen if anybody's interested. And then, yeah, it's kind of, and I also want to go back to what was being talked about before the question in just a second, and I'll be brief. But just watching shows like RuPaul's Drag Race or Pose help me feel connected. Chelsea, what you were saying earlier about, you know, queens having to learn how to run their own video, I'm sure that's going to be a challenge now in the next season of RPDR if it goes on. But about what we all have to do, I mean, Hunter painted a very, a picture that's like cold water to the face about everything that we're going through. And then I have to add that I really don't think this is going to stop anytime soon. This is going to go on longer than any of us really hope it will. The virus is different than HIV. It's a coronavirus, so it's a little bit easier to do a vaccine, but we haven't developed a vaccine for HIV in 40 years. So it's, you know, it's going to take a while before we can return to normal. And I think that organizations and artists all have to think about extreme pivots and really rethink how you're doing what you're doing and what's important about what you're doing and how to accomplish that. What is your mission? What is your mission as an artist? What is your mission as an organization? And how can you do that now?
Anybody else on that question? I think I'd like to say that being at home gives me some time to watch, you know, since Rick mentioned Netflix, it gives me some time to watch work in progress on HBO. Yes, I have my own access to HBO and Netflix and all that stuff, but I do teach film, so it's work. And a work in progress is just an example of something that's come to the larger audience. There are people there who've never knowingly met a trans person. They've never dealt with a trans person's issues. They've never been in a genderqueer context where you see a person hanging out with their friends and their family that loves and accepts them, and is, you know, like everybody else on TV, is neurotic and self-punishing. It's just, you know, for me, all the issues of lack of subtlety and lack of nuance, et cetera, aside, I'm continue to be fascinated by how popular culture can support us, even when it's existing in an admittedly, you know, repulsive economic system. So Colby says we have some more questions.
Another question part.
Yes, we've got a question from Lydia C.
Lydia.
Yes, I'm going to unmute her right now. Lydia's wanting to refer to the poverty porn issue. Individuals responsible for their own agency. How can archives, libraries, and special collections better facilitate the recording and amplifying historically marginalized voices?
Well, as somebody who runs an archive and library, let me give a shot at that. I mentioned a little bit about the idea of a lot of these organizations being undercapitalized, and that's very true. At Stonewall, we're located in Fort Lauderdale. We have 28,000 volumes of queer literature, biography, and art in our library. In our archives, we have 2,700 linear feet, which actually means 6 million pieces of paper. And it mostly relates to the southeastern United States. And it's mostly from the last quarter of the 20th century to the present day. And it's quite an amazing trove of things that we have here that we catalog and show and exhibit and translate. Remembering, of course, that, you know, the history is written by the survivors, and historians look at facts in order to write history for the future. And so what we have is what there is left of a past time. But we have a $5,000 acquisition budget. So what that means is that the majority of the stuff comes in over the transom. And so for libraries and archives, I think that particularly queer ones, we need to be far more strategic than bringing documents and things in which are simply the result of what somebody wants to discard. It's, of course, mostly all gay, mostly all queer, but we need to be able to be more embracing. And we have to realize that those that have the ability to make those gifts, most of the time, they're over 60, over 70 years old who are making those things. They're primarily male and they're primarily white. And we have to appreciate that that creates a narrative which is not fair about the future. So the job that we have to do is we have to work very hard to fill those blanks in. And if you go to our website, you go to any of the other gay archives website, you'll see there are probably 25 or 35 great gay archives and libraries throughout the United States. And take a minute and research some of those and think about how they actually work, and ways of trying to help them expand what they have in their collection. Because it's something that the way it works, it's not really designed to be as inclusive as everybody would like it to be.
And I'd like to jump in on this one too, because it's very important for us to document what's happening right now. We have these great archives going on, but today I actually worked with, I basically select the plays and performances staged in the Washington area for the Washington Area Performing Arts Video Archive. That's something I've done for some time, and it's always been interesting deliberating with a limited budget what performances scholars, students, professionals are going to be interested in seeing in 10, 20, whatever, 100 years. And today we just began to reach an agreement on archiving the transition of theatrical companies and performers to video as part of our mission. And we are seeking particular funding. And of course, on the project, one of my issues is always to push for greater inclusion of women, people of color, and queer people. And it seems like we're really doing okay with that for pushing towards funding. I know Annie Flanagan had something she wanted to mention. Hi, Annie.
Hey, so I guess this ties into the first question that was asked. But I think what is deeply lost with the removal of local newspapers is that town archive and those city archives. And when all of your newspapers are located in major metropolitan areas, and then most of those newspapers are, for the most part, clickbait, or owned by like one large corporation, that like the towns don't have that, like there aren't as many photographers out in their towns right now photographing this as it's happening because there aren't newspapers employing them. And what is lost within the newspaper isn't only the daily news, but also that archive that's made like by someone living in that community. So I know it's something that bums me out. But
yeah.
I don't, buy a newspaper for a whole town if you can. I don't know.
Thank you. Did anyone else on the panel want to address this?
Yeah, I was actually right off the bat thinking it really matters who's in positions of leadership at these archives. So if you want people represented in the archive, they need to be in positions of decision making, period. And if that's not possible, then there need to be initiatives to see to it that folks are able to create a channel for their stories to make it to that archive. It's not always possible to see somebody else's experience, even with the best of intentions. So to make it possible to be open to someone offering it, even if they wanted to, because a lot of folks say, well, this is not going to be representative of me. Why should I bother? Why is the burden on my back to create my own representation there if you're not going to show up for me? And that's where, like, I'll just say Queer Appalachia. I think one of the reasons why that hits home for so many queer Appalachians is because there's content created by queer Appalachians that speaks directly to our experience. And how did that happen? Well, somebody created a channel for it to happen, and it was spearheaded by queer Appalachians. So I think there's a lot of ways to complicate it, but one of the major things you can do is just ensure that folks are in decision-making positions and positions of leadership at those archives.
Thank you. It's 10:15, and our original plan was to save some time at the end for kind of sharing of resources, if people had particular things that they wanted to share. But I'm going to say, in the position of moderator, let's get to a couple more questions, and then we'll point to some of the resources that are available online. But if you are in the audience watching it that is not a member of the panel, and there's anything that you want to share as a resource, if you want to give us a web link or anything of that kind, if you just want to mention something, Colby will start to list those up. We will get a list, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about some of them before we go, but we will at least be able to put them in our list on the Homeschool Revolve website, because I had the feeling about halfway through tonight that this is the first installment. We've been talking about various kinds of online get-togethers we can have through Revolve right now, just check-ins with people, and maybe it's good to just check in and have a conversation about these things sometimes. Colby has some questions from the viewers and listeners.
I'm going to give Crane an opportunity to respond. They would like to just pipe in on a couple of the issues that we've just been talking about. So Crane, I think you're able to speak at the moment.
Cool, thanks. And I'm sorry in advance, my animals are fighting in the background, so that's what the weird noises are. I guess, like, to me, it seems like there's a really simple way to make sure that that like whether it's rural communities or queer communities or communities of color or the the pause community in like the different place it is now than it was 20 or 30 years ago or beyond, the easiest way to make sure those things are documented is to like buy a bunch of cameras with your money, bring them to people and say, hey, we'll pay you to document your lives. And then you're not only like actually going to get a more authentic view of who these people are, but you're also empowering them to develop something that they might have never even like thought of dreaming of. Like if someone had dropped a camera with me in my crappy little swamp hometown, like I can't imagine the kind of difference that would have made. And I think that that's one of those, like, I think that even for artists and radicals and whatever, because of the society we all live in, we kind of have this tendency to want to make everything like, okay, well, we get grants and then we decide, what we're going to do with that money. And then it's supposed to be this like trickle down thing when like we all know that doesn't work. So instead we could just give them cameras and then pay them for their photos when we show them. That's all. You can mute me again.
Thank you. I just want to mention that many years ago, I think it was during the Reagan administration, we had a project at the Corcoran Gallery of Art called Shooting Back. Colby was the photographer, Steve Goldberg, maybe?
No, that was Jim Goldberg. But
Jim Goldberg.
But that's a different project.
But it was giving cameras to kids in DC schools.
Yes.
Thanks. Colby, you have a couple more questions.
Yes, we've got two really good questions. They're different subjects, but I think it'd be important to give an opportunity for both these questions to be aired. One is from Kate Everett, who's the outreach director at the Black Mountain College Museum and Art Center. As cultural organizations have the opportunity to connect more intimately with audiences and artists in their home, how can we avoid exploiting this vulnerability and ensure that we can create safe spaces while honoring the raw emotions that we all are dealing with? And that's open to anyone.
Yeah, that's to anyone.
I want to actually ask this of Liz. It's not really fair to like punt this over to Liz, but because something that Liz does really well with subjects, well, I don't know, Liz just helps people find their safe spaces, I guess I should say. So I want to say that, but first I'll say, I don't think it's up to us to create anything for anybody else. Like, I don't think we can ever effectively create a safe space for someone else. We have to make sure that someone has the means to create their own safe space and then appreciate that and accept it and make sure it's consensual. So I think just coming at it from a different angle is one way. And then I want to kind of kick it over to Liz and say, what's your perspective on safe spaces? Because this is kind of your wheelhouse.
So I would just say for honoring people's safe spaces, to definitely say like in your language, like, is this within like your capacity? Like if this isn't, like we've used that language a lot with Southern Equality Studios, like being like humane when speaking to somebody, like, is this in your bandwidth? Is this in your capacity? If it's not, I totally understand. And I feel as though that creates like a conversation of honesty where people are like, before COVID, I feel as though people were a little bit more impatient with getting results. And yeah, you just have to just be gentle with people during this time. I'm not an expert during this time with entering people's safe spaces. The only thing that I have is just like being me and just reaching out to people and trying to be sweet and patient. I did recently, I did like a photo shoot with one of my friends, and they've been like a model for me multiple times. And we just try to like figure out like what's the safest way to like try to encapsulate that you're like a graduate during this weird time, and let's just like, if we can't go into like our own intimate spaces, like let's try to be out in like the wide open. And also like that's basically the only way that I've been comfortable with taking photos of people. And also this person works at Whole Foods, as do I. So that's like another weird situation where I think it's a little bit easier to have a safe space conversation with this person, because we both kind of like feel as though we're probably vectors of whatever's going on. So it's a weird wheelhouse that I'm not an expert in whatsoever. It's weird. So I don't have a black and white answer for you. I'm sorry.
I would like to say that I conduct these dream workshops. And so one thing that, you know, strikes me a lot, we heard a few years ago a lot about studies that supposedly showed quantitatively that the experience of art develops empathy in people, and that when people do not read books, look at art, think about art, they are less inclined to develop empathy. They're less inclined to imagine themselves in somebody else's situation. I'm always a little bit skeptical about the capacity to prove that, but it does seem to come back to empathy, and we're very distracted sometimes and treat our projections as if they were empathy. I know what's going on with that person. I feel so deeply what's happening with them, when you're just imagining them as just like yourselves with a different costume on. Real empathy is very difficult to establish. Anybody else on that?
I was gonna mention that I think for me, I always come back to the standpoint that under a system of capitalism, there is really no system of care in place. Capitalism is, by definition, robs us of the ability to create these very intricate systems of care for one another that are not predicated on access or money or economics or financial stability. And so sort of, there's no real answer to that, but just sort of just recognizing that fact of we live under this system that every day tries to negate care for ourselves and for other people. And one thing that in my own experience with being at the gallery and working with hundreds of artists and community members who come in and other curators, is for me, because care and empathy are so integral to my practice as just both a human being and a curator and a writer and everything else, I try to create a relationship with those people that are not predicated on the sort of capitalist value that they bring to the space. And I notice so many times that because these artists are often caught up in these larger institutional systems, that they've been treated poorly, or they're just looked at simply for their work, or they're sort of used for the credibility that they bring or the audience that they bring, and there's no real investment in them as a person. When they come to a space that first and foremost is interested in their well-being as a human person, rather than their ability to be a great photographer or a great writer or whatever other value on top of that, allows this sort of barrier to be broken, where they sort of begin to open up more and feel that they're in a space that's more comfortable for them. And it's such a noticeable difference for me when individuals come into the space, and it allows that collaboration to just become so much more deeper and richer. And so all that to be said, I think for me, it's beginning from a standpoint of valuing somebody simply for just their humanity versus valuing them because they have 35,000 followers on Instagram, or they bring a huge donor base with them, or they whatever, you know what I mean? It can get so many times it can sort of get caught up in that, and then your relationship with that person revolves simply around that fact that you have that common tie, that person has some sort of cultural equity that they bring with them, versus really forming a relationship with that person on a one-to-one human level, and they're able, they feel seen, they feel like somebody is actually in their corner for once. And this is speaking in sort of larger institutions where, if anybody has worked in big institutions, you know, there's such a deep, profound lack of care and empathy. And so trying to sort of mitigate and push back against that when you can.
Okay, thank you. We really should wrap up soon. I think there's a lot of people interested in hanging out, and we can do that some, but I don't want to keep our invited guests or anyone else here too late tonight. There is one thing I'd like to mention that's come up in several things that several people have said. I said I wanted to go back to this question about how art is a catalyst for change. And I think, you know, Revolve started with some pretty intense discussions which we had with people in Asheville. And we looked at the economic situation in Appalachia and said, we're, you know, heading towards what we'd like to think is a tipping point, you know, as unpleasant as it is to contemplate. When economies collapse, when traditional sources of resources and of work begin to fade, there's two approaches that people take. One is to come up with plans for completely transforming the world. And there are effective examples of that. And the other is to try to seize power through promulgating a kind of bizarre nostalgia, as if we would be able to go back and, you know, what I'm talking about is revive the coal mines, etc. And art, in a variety of different forms, has the capacity to actually bring people over from the dark side to the side of goodness and light, and planning for real change. And I think maybe that's the precise subject matter for an extended discussion yet to come. So I do want to mention that I'd like to give the panelists in particular an opportunity to say something as we close tonight, if they're willing to stay. We have a very large number of distinguished guests in our audience. There's a lot of people with a lot of backgrounds, and we really, really appreciate them being here. And we trust that if you had something you wanted to comment on or contribute to the discussion, you felt like you had the opportunity to do so by entering them into chat. And we would love to hear from you about anything you'd like to comment on about how these various talks and events are going, because as we say, we're learning our way through it. It's almost for us like we've started a school, and we need to hear from everybody, faculty, students, staff, etc. How they feel things are going. So Colby, I'm going to toss this to you to do the question that you wanted to wrap with, and then I will ask the panel if there's any last words they particularly want to give. They don't have to.
Thanks, Bernard. Maybe this will be a good way to segue into that last comment from each of the panelists. Kelly Hendrickson has asked, and I'll unmute you, Kelly, if you'd like to speak with some of the panelists. They've asked if Hunter or any of the panelists could talk more about the types of programming they're developing and what platforms are they using, what's working, what's not, what kind of experience have you had in this new COVID-19 period as a way to communicate with your audience, and what have you found works and what doesn't work. And if you mention some things that I can grab and drop in the chat, I will, but this will help us also segue into the resources element, which before we close tonight, we'll show you a place to go to collect, where we're collecting all these resources for you to be able to go to after tonight's program to take a peek at your own leisure. But before that, are there any of the panelists that would like to talk about the types of programming that are working or not working and what they're developing under these new circumstances that we're living in?
Let me jump in since part of that was directed to me. What we've done up front is really something just like what we're doing right now, in which we're not limiting ourselves to our geographic region, but we're using our connections to reach out to other people. And we're doing readings, we're doing slide talks, we're doing substantive conversations, and we're finding an audience throughout the United States. And so that's one thing which I think is really worthwhile. We're also putting our exhibitions online. Many museums are doing that as well too, and I think that's been very popular. We've been showing a lot of film online as well too, and we've been getting the rights to do those. And again, people want to get involved. Just switching over to the other question that was asked, which is about resources. There are a couple of resources I want to be sure everyone's aware of. One is if you want us to get any message out to our constituencies, just email me through our website. It's hunter@stonewall-museum.org, and we'll be happy to send that out there. So that's easy in order to be able to pump stuff out there. Number two, if you look at our website, we have, over the last year before this all started, we tried to start putting some substance on there. So in the archive section, you can't search the archives online, but what you can do is you can see all of the subject headings that then give you some idea as to what you want to speak to somebody about if we have something, and you can then begin to do searching that way. The third thing is in our library with 28,000 LGBTQ books, you can actually search online every single title and a description of those books. And so whether it's biography, they're all cataloged by the Library of Congress section, but you can drop the name in there. There's a search function there, and you can do that. Next on the website is a list of 25 or 30 LGBTQ archives around the United States. There are several in the Southeast United States. You can find resources there, and you can find people that you can reach out and be able to work together. And then last thing, we hold an annual symposium every year for school for administrators, educators, and people who work in elementary schools and high schools, specifically devoted to trying to help queer kids, trans kids at risk, and try to develop policies that can be implemented in the local school system. That's been going on now for 7 or 8 years. There is a network in 40 states now of educators and administrators who are involved in that network. And just this last year, we launched something called SNEP Connect, and you can sign up for that for free. There's no paywall, and you'll see half a dozen, if not a dozen, different categories about dealing with administration, legal issues, sexual issues, and a variety of things, and a way of sharing resources, particularly for those who are concerned with helping LGBTQ youth at risk. So there's a lot there, and it's there basically for all of us to use.
Thank you. Everybody else, Stephen, Liz, Al, Andy, I think you may also have experience of what's being talked about here.
And Chelsea.
Resources. And Chelsea. Everybody.
I'll say really quickly, when we saw that life was changing as we know it at the Campaign for Southern Equality, we just knew that people needed money, and we had some. We don't have much, but $150 means groceries for somebody. And whether it comes from an arts organization or a social justice nonprofit, that's life-changing at a time like this. Lots of people are talking about mutual aid, and I feel like it's really important to support really creative mutual aid efforts. Chelsea has one of those that they could talk about. But the other thing that's happening is at CSE, we talked with other organizations, even the Center for Craft in Asheville developed a grant round that's happening now between now and October. That's a Craft Futures Fund that is that's out, and that's a resource we'll share a link to. But the key takeaway is give people the means to access. If the means to access is financial and you've got some of that you can leverage, yeah, artists need food, artists need gas, artists need rent. And so for us, it was like, well, we don't do direct services, but through queer artist meetups, we can provide some connection. We can provide some humanity. We can provide the space for people to talk about what they need and what they want. And And then organizationally, we just found a way to mobilize the financial resources that we could. So that, yeah, that's the sort of programming, I guess, that came out of this for us.
Thank you. Anyone else? Here we are.
Like Hunter was saying, we've gone digital with many of our programs, and we're looking at, since we won't be having exhibitions in a space anytime soon, we're looking at public art as an option for the community here in Houston. But I think we are trying to think about ways to expand that platform, to give artists platforms from which to develop their work, to talk about their work and all of those things, as well as to create connections. One of the things we did when our portfolio review was shut down is we connected the reviewers with all the artists so that they could have online reviews. And we will eventually reopen those reviews again. But I've been, I'm really impressed by what Queer Appalachia is doing and how they're providing direct financial assistance to some of the artists, and I think that's great. We have some of that in Houston too, so it's really, really important. FotoFest also got one of the PPP loans, and through that we've been able to keep our core staff employed and to keep our teaching artists employed. We worked with the local school systems to pivot our in-school learning program to digital programs, and that's been able to keep over 15 teaching artists to keep working, which is something else that we can do that's really important to us.
Chelsea, your picture's up. Does that mean you're speaking?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm trying to get in there. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is how art is really helpful to remind us how cool activism is, and how a lot of what we do is like an entry point to becoming more engaged in politics. Like specifically, Queer Appalachia is an entry point into radicalizing for a lot of people in Appalachia, the South, rural areas, and sometimes even beyond. And one of the reasons why I think we're pretty successful at doing this is because we've always prioritized accessibility. We're able to distill like Marxist theology down to memes, which has always been really relatable to people. And it's through like memes, digital art, and other content, we've been able to like spread these concepts fairly wide. And we're living in a time right now where everything's kind of getting shaken up and questioned, and our systems are really being examined. Like specifically, we're starting to have some very real conversations about how healthcare, the healthcare of a population can't be prioritized under capitalism. We're coming to terms with that, and we're coming to terms with a lot of other complicated ideas around like accessibility. And one of the things that we think about a lot at Queer Appalachia is metronormativity. This idea that the gay experience revolves around the cities or urban centers. And one of the interesting things to happen out of this pandemic is that those physical places that we reside in are becoming more irrelevant. And we're getting to hear more from people who live in rural areas. We're getting to hear more about the rural gays, the folks who normally don't have the same amount of access to screen time or resources. And that's something that we're trying to watch for on the future and see how this develops, because it is something that we're a fan of.
Thank you. I want to mention that when we started the homeschool part of the Revolve project, the first conversation that we had was really about how the concepts of local and community are now changing. And we do want to catch up with them, and we want to profit from everything that people get out of regionalism and of knowing where they come from, and from everything that we get out of being connected to one another across vast distances. So Colby, I think we should kind of draw things to a close. I'd really like to give the panelists the opportunity to say any last words if they want to, although there's no pressure to do that.
Sounds great. Also, we might just share the resources page.
Yes, yeah, I was just giving a chance before we do that. So I'm not hearing from anybody. You can unmute yourself if you want to do that. We'll show the resources page, and I assure you that a lot of these links we've created are aggregating a lot of others. So they have within them, you find on the page that you go to, links to some of the other resources that we'll mention, but we're going to create as complete a list as we can to have available on the Revolve website. Colby.
Would you like for me to share that page?
Yeah, have you got it up?
I can do that. There we go. Are folks seeing that now?
Oh, we see the homeschool ID. We are scrolling down the page. You're scrolling down the page. We're going to the resources link is where you'll find this.
And it's on, it's right here. You just need to go to Homeschool Revolve. I'll drop this in the chat when I get back to the chat. That's where you'll find it. It'll be updated tonight and tomorrow, and all the panelists and Al and Liz and Bernard and I will collate these links and put them all on this document that you can have access to at your leisure. Starting tomorrow would be best, but you can go and take a look at it now if you'd like, and if I take a peek at it for you.
Great.
And we'll add to
that. I'll just jump in. It's Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this, and I'm so impressed by the work that everybody here is doing, and thankful for it. So hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again soon.
Stephen, I'm so glad to see you after however long. Yeah, so thank you. We're going to continue to work on that the resources stuff. Anybody else in the panel? So I'd like to just say hello to the audience. If everybody in the audience wants to just, if you're muted, but if your image is up, panelists or audience, just wave hello, everybody. We're going to say goodbye in just a moment, but Colby has a few things to say. I think one thing, I'm going to exert the moderator's privilege and try to say this rather rapidly, that I'm thinking about artists in this particular moment, and LGBTQ artists and artists in Appalachia maybe in particular, is we are faced with this narrative that we're stuck with. It's very much the kind of thing that What You're Getting Wrong About Appalachia talks about. And we're always told that there's two sides to all these questions, and those sides are identified with political parties. And those two sides, unfortunately, to my mind, seem to agree about certain things. They create a narrative that we're all sort of stuck with. And a central feature of that narrative is that somehow or other, even though we have different solutions to the problem, we're going to have to choose between economic security and the well-being of our friends and neighbors. And that's a false dichotomy. It's not necessary to set things up that way. We don't have to be using phrases like, having a hard look at or making tough decisions. I mean, they are tough decisions, but they're not tough decisions for the reasons that are being presented to us. What art traditionally does, it redefines those narratives for us. And I'm really hoping that Revolve will be involved in that.
Thanks, Bernard. Are you frozen? You might be. While he becomes unfrozen, I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. We're going to wrap things up. We'll keep this open for a little bit to see if folks want to continue the conversation after the fact. But I just want to take this opportunity to say that anyone that bought a ticket or donated for tonight's program, this monies will be split evenly between Revolve and Southern Equality Studios. This is how we're able to do this kind of programming and how we're able to get together and work work on these kind of issues that are important to all our communities. I'm going to drop in the chat how you can check out and help support Southern Equality's project through donating to their page. And you also can help by donating to us as well. Our hope is to continue to find ways to get this money, as has been said really clearly tonight, is one of the best ways that we can help our communities is by directly getting the money to artists and folks in need within our communities without any red tape or jumping through hoops. Just direct help would be the best. And that's what we would like to work on. And these are ways that you can help us do that. But more importantly, the best way is just to participate, which is what most of you have done tonight. And we want to thank you so very much. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank Bernard for doing the job of the moderator and doing a wonderful job of keeping things flowing. I'm going to, like I said, keep this open and people can come and go as they wish. I'd like folks to feel comfortable staying here for a few more minutes. And I would also like to remind folks, you please can check out our programming that's coming up next week, which I think will be a wonderful program with two amazing poets that will speak very clearly to our communities. So thanks everyone, I appreciate it. Homeschool appreciates it, and we'll see you next week, or we'll see you in some other version of what we're doing these days. Thank you.